Flight attendant kicks black girl off plane. 7 minutes later, she owns the airline. The fluorescent lights of Flight 287 cast harsh shadows across the first-class cabin as Miranda Scott's voice cut through the hushed atmosphere. "I'm going to have to ask you to move." Her words, though quietly delivered, carried an edge that drew every passenger's attention to the confrontation unfolding in seat 3A. Ava Carter sat perfectly still, her hand clutching a worn envelope addressed in her dying mother's handwriting. She had been reading it when Miranda approached, the words, "My dearest daughter, if you're reading this," still visible on the page. "I have a valid first-class ticket," Ava responded, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Miranda's lips tightened into a thin line. "There seems to be a misunderstanding with your booking." Her emphasis on misunderstanding made several passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. The older gentleman across the aisle lowered his newspaper, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. "The only misunderstanding," Ava replied, carefully folding her mother's letter, "is your assumption about where I belong." The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Her phone buzzed again, another message from the hospital about her mother's deteriorating condition. "Either you move to economy," Miranda's voice dropped to a harsh whisper, "or I'll have security remove you from this flight." The threat lingered between them, surrounded by the mechanical hum of the aircraft and the collective held breath of the other passengers. Ava stood slowly, her designer suit a stark contrast to Miranda's prejudiced assumptions. As she gathered her belongings, her mother's letter slipped from her grasp, floating to the floor. Miranda moved to pick it up, catching a glimpse of the hospital letterhead before Ava quickly retrieved it. Their eyes met briefly, one set filled with quiet dignity, the other with dawning uncertainty. Neither woman knew it then, but this moment would change both their lives forever. If you found yourself gripped by this story's opening scene, join our storytelling community by subscribing. Together, let's uncover more powerful narratives that touch hearts, spark conversations, and remind us of our shared humanity. Don't miss what happens next. Born into a middle-class family in Chicago's South Side, Ava Carter learned early that success demanded twice the effort when you didn't fit society's preferred mold. Her mother, Sarah Carter, a dedicated English teacher at the local high school, had raised her alone after Ava's father passed away when she was just 6. Their modest apartment above Willie's Jazz Club became both haven and launching pad for Ava's dreams. Sarah sacrificed everything for Ava's education, working extra tutoring shifts to afford the private school that would give her daughter better opportunities. But even there, excellence wasn't enough to shield Ava from prejudice. She still remembered sitting alone at lunch tables, watching other parents pull their children away during pickup, and hearing whispers that her scholarship was just filling a quota. Yet it was Sarah who taught Ava that dignity was the strongest response to discrimination. "Stand tall," she'd say, straightening Ava's uniform collar each morning. "Your worth isn't determined by their limitations." Those words became Ava's armor as she graduated valedictorian, earned her way through Harvard Business School, and climbed the corporate ladder with unwavering determination. Now, at 34, Ava had become more than successful, she was influential. As a major shareholder in several airlines and board member of multiple corporations, she wielded the kind of power that made others listen. Her office overlooked Manhattan's skyline, her name appeared in business magazines, and her voice carried weight in boardrooms across the country. But success hadn't hardened her. Instead, it fueled her mission to create change from within. She established mentorship programs for underprivileged students, pushed for diversity in corporate leadership, and never forgot her mother's lessons about dignity and perseverance. Her personal assistant, Maya, often remarked that Ava's office door was always open to those seeking guidance or support. Recently, however, Ava's carefully constructed world had begun to crack. Sarah, her cornerstone and compass, was losing her battle with aggressive cancer. The hospital bills mounted despite Ava's resources, but it wasn't money that kept Ava awake at night, it was time. Every minute away from her mother's bedside felt like betrayal, yet Sarah insisted Ava maintain her responsibilities. "Your work matters," Sarah had whispered during Ava's last hospital visit, her once strong voice barely audible. "You're changing things, baby girl. Don't let anything stop you." Those words echoed in Ava's mind as she boarded Flight 287, clutching her mother's latest letter. The doctors had called that morning Sarah's condition was deteriorating rapidly. This flight wasn't just about business, it was a race against time to say goodbye. The letter in her hand was part of a tradition Sarah started when Ava left for college, handwritten wisdom for life's big moments. This one Ava knew would be the last. She hadn't opened it yet, saving it for the quiet moments above the clouds when she could properly honor her mother's words. She never imagined it would become part of a very different story about prejudice, power, and the unexpected paths toward understanding. In her designer suit and carefully composed demeanor, Ava Carter appeared to have everything. But sitting in that first-class seat, watching a flight attendant approach with suspicion in her eyes, Ava was just a daughter trying to reach her dying mother. The prejudice she was about to face would trigger a chain of events that would test everything her mother taught her about dignity, justice, and the true meaning of success. Miranda Scott hadn't always viewed the world through a lens of suspicion and prejudice. 15 years ago, she was a bright-eyed college student with dreams of becoming a teacher, until life threw her its cruelest curveball. Her daughter Emma was born with a rare heart condition that required constant medical attention, and suddenly Miranda's carefully planned future shattered into a mosaic of hospital bills and survival jobs. The airline industry offered what she desperately needed: health insurance and a steady paycheck. Over the years, Miranda worked her way up from ground crew to flight attendant, learning to balance the demanding schedule with single motherhood. Her tiny apartment in Queens became a sanctuary where she and Emma built their own version of happiness between hospital visits and work shifts. Emma, now 12, inherited her mother's determination and infectious smile, despite spending much of her life in and out of hospitals. Their walls were covered with Emma's drawings, bright, hopeful scenes of places she dreamed of visiting once her heart grew stronger. But lately, those dreams seemed further away than ever. The latest medical reports showed Emma's condition worsening, and the experimental treatment that could help remained frustratingly out of reach on Miranda's salary. Each morning, Miranda donned her airline uniform like armor, her perfectly pressed collar and regulation scarf masking the exhaustion of nights spent worrying about bills and treatment options. Her colleagues saw a stern-by-the-book flight attendant, but none knew about the second job she worked between flights, or the growing stack of rejected medical loan applications on her kitchen table. The prejudices that had seeped into Miranda's worldview didn't spring from hatred, but from fear of losing control, fear of not being enough for Emma, fear of a world that seemed increasingly hostile to people just trying to survive. She'd learned to trust rules and procedures because they offered the illusion of order in her chaotic life. Unfortunately, this rigid adherence to the way things should be had slowly warped her perception of who belonged where. That morning before boarding Flight 287, Miranda had received another call from Emma's doctor. The latest round of medications wasn't working as hoped, and without the experimental treatment, Emma's prognosis was becoming dire. The weight of this news pressed against Miranda's chest as she performed her pre-flight checks, her thoughts scattered between medical terms she couldn't fully understand and numbers that wouldn't add up to salvation. Her small apartment held evidence of every sacrifice: the empty walls where artwork once hung, sold to cover emergency room visits; the corner where Emma's beloved piano used to stand before it was traded for medication money; the dining table covered with medical bills and loan applications rather than family dinners. Yet Miranda clung to hope, believing that if she worked hard enough, followed the rules closely enough, somehow she could protect her daughter from a world that seemed determined to break them. What Miranda couldn't see was how her fears and frustrations had begun to color her judgment, leading her to make assumptions about passengers like Ava Carter based on deeply ingrained biases she didn't even recognize. As she prepared to start her shift on Flight 287, Miranda had no idea that her actions would not only jeopardize her career but also force her to confront these prejudices in ways that would reshape both her and Emma's future. The tension in first class thickened as Ava Carter slowly gathered her belongings. Her mother's letter trembled slightly in her hands as she rose from her seat, the quiet dignity in her movements drawing uncomfortable glances from surrounding passengers. Miranda Scott stood watch, her regulation smile fixed firmly in place, though her eyes betrayed a mix of satisfaction and unease. "I can show you to your new seat," Miranda said, her voice carrying that artificial sweetness flight attendants perfect over years of service. But before they could move, an elderly gentleman in 4C cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his Boston accent thick with authority, "but I'd like to understand why this passenger is being moved. Her ticket appears valid." Miranda's smile tightened. "Sir, this is an airline matter," but she was interrupted by another voice, this time from a young business executive across the aisle. "I'd like to know too. I've been flying this route for years, and I've never seen a valid first-class passenger forced to move." The cabin grew quieter, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Ava remained standing, one hand still clutching her mother's letter, the other gripping her designer laptop bag. Her phone buzzed again, another hospital update, but she couldn't check it under Miranda's watchful gaze. "I have the authority to reassign seats as needed for flight balance and safety," Miranda recited, her words sounding hollow even to her own ears. A few rows back, Clara, the junior flight attendant, watched the scene unfold with visible discomfort, her hands fidgeting with her serving cart. "That's interesting," came another voice, this time from a woman in a judge's conference lanyard. "Because I fly weekly and seat reassignment for balance typically happens before boarding, not after a passenger is seated with valid documentation." Miranda's composure cracked slightly. She hadn't expected resistance from other passengers, hadn't planned for the quiet solidarity building in the cabin. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, probably another message about Emma's medication costs, adding to her growing anxiety. Ava finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying an edge that commanded attention. "I understand you're doing your job, MS Scott," she said, gesturing to Miranda's name tag, "but I need to stay connected to my phone during this flight. My mother is in critical condition at Mount Sinai, and first class was the only section with power outlets available when I booked." The revelation hung in the air, heavy with implications. Miranda's face paled slightly, but she pressed on. "I'm sorry about your mother, but rules are rules. We can accommodate your device in economy." Her voice wavered as she remembered Emma's medical charts stacked on her own kitchen table. Just then, Clara stepped forward, breaking protocol. "Miranda, I checked the passenger manifest. There's no technical reason for a seat reassignment. Perhaps we should." "That's enough," Clara, Miranda snapped, her authority fraying at the edges. "Please return to your duties." The tension peaked as Ava's phone buzzed again, more urgently this time. Her hand trembled as she checked the message, and for a moment her composed facade cracked. "My mother's condition is deteriorating," she said quietly, looking directly at Miranda. "I need to make some calls before we take off. Please, I booked this seat specifically for this flight." But Miranda had already committed to her course of action. Fear, prejudice, and the desperate need to maintain control in her own chaotic life had clouded her judgment beyond reason. "I'm sorry, but you'll need to move to economy now, or I'll be forced to call security." The threat hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Other passengers began recording with their phones, their muttered disapproval creating a low buzz of tension. Ava looked at her mother's letter once more, then at her phone displaying increasingly urgent messages from the hospital. With a quiet dignity that would later haunt Miranda's dreams, she gathered her belongings. "I'll move," Ava said, her voice steady despite the circumstances, "but please know that this isn't over. Not because of my position or influence, but because this kind of behavior needs to stop. For everyone who can't fight back." As Ava moved toward economy, Clara quietly slipped her a business card with her personal number written on the back. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'll keep an eye on your phone signal. Let you know if any urgent messages come through." The incident lasted less than 10 minutes, but its implications would ripple through lives and careers far beyond Flight 287. As Miranda returned to the galley, her hands shaking slightly as she prepared for takeoff, she had no idea that her actions would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not only her life and Ava's, but the entire airline industry's approach to discrimination. As Flight 287 reached cruising altitude, the ripple effects of Miranda's decision began spreading through the cabin like wildfire. In economy class, Ava sat rigid in her cramped middle seat, her phone clutched tightly as she tried to maintain connection with the hospital. Around her, passengers who had witnessed the incident were already sharing their recordings on social media, their hushed conversations a mix of outrage and disbelief. Up in first class, the elderly gentleman who had spoken up, Dr. James Wilson, a retired civil rights attorney, was drafting an email to the airline's board of directors. His fingers moved swiftly across his laptop as he detailed the incident with the precision of someone who had spent decades documenting injustice. "In my 50 years of flying," he wrote, "I have never witnessed such a blatant display of discriminatory behavior from airline staff." Clara, torn between professional loyalty and moral obligation, found herself making quick notes about the incident during her breaks. Her hands trembled slightly as she recorded times, witness statements, and key details. The young flight attendant had only been with the airline for 8 months, but she knew that staying silent would make her complicit in something she couldn't morally justify. Back in the galley, Miranda tried to maintain her composure while preparing the drink service, but her hands shook as she arranged the glasses. Dennis, a senior flight attendant, pulled her aside. "What were you thinking?" He whispered harshly. "You can't just move passengers without cause. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble this could bring?" Miranda's reply was cut short by a call from the cockpit. Captain Sarah Reynolds' voice was tense as she requested Miranda's presence. As Miranda made her way forward, she could feel the weight of disapproving stares from passengers who had witnessed the incident. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds didn't mince words. "We're receiving multiple complaints from passengers about your handling of the situation in first class," she said, her expression grave. "The airline's executive office has already been notified. What exactly prompted you to move that passenger?" Before Miranda could respond, another call came through from air traffic control. A medical emergency had been reported at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. A critical patient, Sarah Carter, had taken a turn for the worse. The family was requesting urgent contact with their daughter, who was supposedly on Flight 287. The color drained from Miranda's face as she realized the implications. Captain Reynolds looked at her sharply. "Isn't this the same passenger you moved to economy? The one who mentioned her mother was in critical condition?" Meanwhile, in economy, Ava was desperately trying to get a signal on her phone, her mother's letter now crumpled slightly from being held too tightly. Clara passed by, discreetly slipping her an update. "We're getting emergency messages from Mount Sinai. I'm trying to arrange for you to use the crew phone." The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted dramatically. Passengers who had initially been passive observers were now actively involved, offering Ava their phone chargers and expressing their support. A young woman named Rachel, sitting next to Ava, offered to switch seats so Ava could be closer to the aisle for updates. In first class, the empty seat where Ava had been sitting became a silent testament to the incident. Several passengers had already drafted complaint emails, their fingers flying across keyboards as they detailed what they had witnessed. The judge who had spoken up earlier was on her laptop, composing a formal letter to the airline's legal department. The situation reached a breaking point when Clara, against protocol but following her conscience, patched through an urgent call from Mount Sinai to Ava in economy. The entire cabin fell silent as Ava's muffled sobs cut through the airplane's white noise. Her mother's condition had deteriorated significantly. The doctors weren't sure she would make it through the next few hours. Miranda, returning from the cockpit, overheard the call and froze in the galley. For the first time, the full weight of her actions hit her. She thought of Emma, of all the times she had raced to be by her daughter's side during medical emergencies. The parallel was devastating, but it was too late to undo what she had done. As the flight continued toward New York, the incident had already begun spreading across social media. Passenger videos were being shared thousands of times, news outlets were picking up the story, and the airline's PR team was scrambling to respond. What had started as one flight attendant's prejudice decision was quickly becoming a viral moment that would force an entire industry to confront its biases. The descent into JFK should have been a moment of relief for Ava Carter. Instead, the landing gear's mechanical whine seemed to mock her desperation. After 3 excruciating hours of intermittent updates from Mount Sinai, her phone finally regained full signal as the plane touched down. Immediately, it exploded with messages, missed calls, and voicemails. But one text message from her mother's primary nurse made her heart stop. "I'm so sorry, Ava. She asked for you until the end." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. Sarah Carter had passed away at 4:47 p.m., exactly 38 minutes ago. While Ava had been trapped in economy class, fighting for a signal, her mother had been fighting for her last breaths, hoping to see her daughter one final time. As passengers began their usual rush to deplane, Ava remained seated, her mother's last letter clutched to her chest. Clara, who had been watching for the moment they landed, rushed to her side. "Miss Carter, I've arranged for priority deplaning." She stopped short, seeing the devastation on Ava's face. "She's gone," Ava whispered, her composed facade finally cracking. "I was supposed to have 3 more hours. The doctor said I had time. If I hadn't been moved. If I had better signal. If I could have just told her I was coming." The surrounding passengers, who had witnessed the earlier confrontation, fell silent as they realized what had happened. Rachel, who had shared her armrest with Ava during the flight, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry," she said, her own eyes welling with tears. Miranda, standing at the front of the plane for final deplaning procedures, overheard the commotion. She watched as Clara helped Ava gather her belongings, as passengers offered quiet condolences, as the reality of what her actions had cost became devastatingly clear. Her hands gripped the cabin door handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. Dr. Wilson, the retired civil rights attorney, approached Miranda with barely contained fury. "That woman missed her mother's final moments because of your unfounded prejudice," he said quietly, ensuring other deplaning passengers wouldn't hear. "I hope you understand the weight of what you've done." As Ava made her way up the aisle, passengers parted silently. The letter in her hand, her mother's final words, remained unopened. She couldn't bear to read it now, knowing she had failed to fulfill her mother's last wish to see her. When she reached the front of the plane, she paused briefly beside Miranda. "My mother," Ava said, her voice steady despite her tears, "was a teacher for 30 years. She taught her students that dignity and kindness matter more than prejudice and power. Today you taught me that her work isn't finished." Without waiting for a response, she stepped off the plane. In the jet bridge, Clara caught up with Ava, pressing a handwritten statement into her hands. "I documented everything," she said firmly. "Times, witnesses, conversations. What happened today wasn't right, and I want to help make it right." Meanwhile, Miranda stood frozen at her post, mechanically thanking passengers as they deplaned. Each person who passed seemed to carry an accusation in their eyes. Her phone buzzed a message from Emma's babysitter. "Emma's asking when you'll be home. She's had a rough day at school again." The irony wasn't lost on Miranda. While she had been exercising her prejudice and power over Ava, her own daughter had been struggling with similar treatment. The weight of her actions pressed against her chest like a physical pain. As the last passengers deplaned, Dennis approached Miranda. "The captain wants to see you," he said grimly, "and the airline's executive office is on the line. They've already received over 50 complaints, including video footage of the incident." But Miranda barely heard him. Her eyes were fixed on something Ava had dropped during deplaning, a small hospital visitor's badge. Picking it up, she read the patient's name, Sarah Carter, terminal care unit. The date stamp showed daily visits, sometimes multiple times per day, evidence of a daughter's devotion now ended by prejudice and poor judgment. The empty cabin seemed to echo with the consequences of her actions. Somewhere in Manhattan, the daughter would walk into a hospital room too late, carrying an unopened letter and an aftermath of regret. And somewhere in Queens, Miranda's own daughter was waiting, unaware that her mother's actions today would change both their lives forever. Clara, returning to clean the cabin, found Miranda still standing there holding the visitor's badge. "You know," Clara said quietly, "Mrs. Carter was a public school teacher. She spent her life fighting against the kind of prejudice you showed her daughter today. And now she'll never know that her last lesson on dignity came at such a high price." After her shift ended, Miranda trudged through the front door of her Queens apartment, emotionally drained from the day's events. The sound of muffled sobbing stopped her in her tracks. Following the noise, she found 12-year-old Emma curled up on her bed, face buried in her pillow. "Honey, what's wrong?" Miranda rushed to her daughter's side, heart racing. Emma's school backpack lay torn on the floor, its contents scattered. A crumpled paper caught Miranda's eye, a math test with a perfect score, defaced with cruel comments scrawled in marker. "Nobody likes a sick kid's charity work, and teacher's pet only passed because they feel sorry for you." Emma finally looked up, her face streaked with tears. "They said I don't belong in advanced math," she whispered. "Jessica told everyone I only got in because teachers pity me. At lunch, they moved their seats when I tried to sit down. They said someone like me doesn't fit in with their group." The words hit Miranda like physical blows, each one eerily echoing her own actions on Flight 287. Her daughter continued, unaware of her mother's growing horror. "The worst part is Mrs. Thompson saw everything. She just watched them move away from me like I was invisible, like I didn't deserve to be there. Miranda sat heavily on the bed, pulling Emma close. Her mind flashed to Ava Carter, standing dignified as Miranda had forced her to move, treating her as if she didn't belong. The parallel was devastating. "Did you tell the principal?" Miranda managed to ask. "What's the point?" Emma's voice carried a resignation that no 12-year-old should know. "It'll just make things worse. Besides, they're right. I'm different. I don't fit in. Maybe I should just switch to regular classes." The words struck a chord deep within Miranda. How many times had she justified her own prejudices by telling herself some people just didn't fit in certain spaces? How many times had she been like Mrs. Thompson, wielding authority to enforce these artificial boundaries? Emma reached for her bedside table, pulling out a wrinkled hospital pamphlet about the experimental treatment that could help her heart condition. "Maybe we should stop trying so hard," she said quietly. "Stop pretending I can have a normal life. It's exhausting, Mom, trying to prove I belong." Miranda's phone buzzed another email about the flight incident. She ignored it, focusing instead on her daughter's hurt. The same hurt she had callously inflicted on another daughter rushing to her dying mother. The realization made her physically ill. "Show me who wrote on your test," Miranda said, her voice shaking. Emma pointed to several names, including Jessica Thompson, the math teacher's daughter, the same teacher who had stood by and watched Emma being ostracized. "You know what's funny?" Emma continued, wiping her eyes. "Jessica's mom keeps talking about maintaining classroom standards, but last week, when I helped Jessica understand polynomial equations, she got the same score as me. She belonged there because of her mom. I had to prove I belonged." The bitter irony of the situation crashed over Miranda. She had spent her day enforcing her own prejudices about who belonged in first class while her daughter suffered from the same arbitrary judgments. Both situations stemmed from the same toxic root, the belief that some people needed to prove their right to occupy certain spaces. Taking the defaced test in trembling hands, Miranda remembered Dr. Wilson's words on the plane that woman missed her mother's final moments because of your unfounded prejudice. Now, looking at her daughter's tear-stained face, she understood the full weight of what prejudice could cost not just careers or moments, but dignity, opportunity, and hope. Emma's bedside table was covered with medication bottles, each one representing a battle for survival. Next to them sat a framed photo of her winning last year's math competition, her smile bright despite the IV port visible under her sleeve. She had earned her place in that advanced class, just as Ava Carter had earned her seat in first class. But both had been judged by assumptions rather than achievements. "Mom," Emma's voice pulled Miranda from her thoughts. "Do you think it'll ever be different? Will there ever be a time when I don't have to prove I deserve to be somewhere?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications Miranda was only now beginning to fully grasp. Her daughter's experience was a mirror, reflecting back the very prejudices she had enacted hours earlier. The realization sparked something in her, a determination that this cycle of discrimination had to end. By sunrise the next morning, the incident on Flight 287 had exploded across social media. Passenger videos went viral, accompanied by hashtags like first-class discrimination and justice for Ava. The clips showed the confrontation from multiple angles, capturing both Miranda's rigid prejudice and Ava's dignified response. But it was the aftermath that truly captured public attention, the revelation that Ava had missed her mother's final moments due to the forced seat change. Major news networks picked up the story, their headlines growing increasingly condemning discrimination at 30,000 feet. Woman misses mother's death after being forced from first class, an airline under fire as passengers' last chance to say goodbye stolen by prejudice. The airline's stock price began to plummet as investors reacted to the growing scandal. Dr. James Wilson, the retired civil rights attorney who had witnessed the incident, appeared on several morning shows. "What we witnessed wasn't just an isolated incident of bias," he stated firmly. "It was a manifestation of systemic discrimination that continues to plague our society. Ms. Carter's achievement and success should have protected her from such treatment, but instead they made her a target for someone's unfounded assumptions." Clara's documented account of the incident, submitted to both airline management and civil rights organizations, provided a devastating timeline. Her detailed notes revealed not just the discrimination but the human cost. At 4:15 p.m. Ms. Carter received notification of her mother's deteriorating condition due to poor signal in economy class and the denied access to first-class power outlets. She was unable to maintain consistent contact with the hospital. Mrs. Sarah Carter passed away at 4:47 p.m., her last words asking for her daughter. Social media erupted with personal stories of similar experiences. Share Your Flight became a trending hashtag as thousands shared their own encounters with discrimination in the travel industry. Among them, a comment from Rachel, Ava's seatmate in economy, went viral. "I watched a daughter lose her last chance to say goodbye to her mother because someone decided she didn't look like she belonged in first class. How many more moments like this are we willing to steal from each other?" The airline's initial response, a generic statement about investigating the incident, only fueled public outrage. Corporate sponsors began distancing themselves and civil rights organizations called for boycotts. The story took an even more poignant turn when Sarah Carter's former students began sharing memories online. Pictures emerged of the dedicated teacher who had spent 3 decades fighting prejudice in her classroom, only to have her daughter face that same prejudice in her final hours. Local news crews camped outside Mount Sinai Hospital, capturing the heart-wrenching moment Ava finally arrived, too late to say goodbye. The image of her clutching her mother's unopened letter as she entered the hospital became a powerful symbol of the human cost of discrimination. Viewers watched as this successful businesswoman, stripped of her power suit and composed demeanor, transformed into simply a grieving daughter who had been robbed of a precious final moment. Meanwhile, Miranda Scott's identity became public when a passenger's blog post went viral. Within hours, her social media accounts were flooded with angry messages. Some called for her firing, others demanded criminal charges for civil rights violations. The airline placed her on immediate administrative leave pending investigation, but the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. The story took an unexpected turn when someone leaked Emma's school incident from the same day. A parent at the school connected the dots. The flight attendant who had discriminated against a passenger was the mother of a chronically ill child who faced similar prejudice. The irony was not lost on the public, and the narrative began to shift from simple outrage to a deeper examination of how prejudice perpetuates itself. News vans parked outside Miranda's Queens apartment, hoping to catch a comment from the flight attendant at the center of the storm. Instead, they captured footage of Emma trying to get to her doctor's appointment, struggling through a gauntlet of reporters while already battling her health conditions. The public's anger temporarily softened as they witnessed a child being affected by her mother's actions. By evening, the story had evolved into a national conversation about prejudice, power, and the moments we can never get back. Social media was filled with people sharing their own stories of missed goodbyes, of times when discrimination had stolen irreplaceable moments. Ava Carter's experience had touched a nerve, forcing society to confront the real, human cost of its biases. In her Manhattan office, Ava finally opened her mother's letter, reading it through tears as news helicopters hovered outside. The letter's contents would remain private, but its existence, a mother's final words unread until it was too late, became a powerful reminder of what prejudice had stolen that day on Flight 287. In the days following the Flight 287 incident, both the Carter and Scott households found their lives irrevocably altered. For Ava, grief became a public spectacle. Every time she left her apartment, cameras followed, seeking commentary on airline discrimination while she was simply trying to plan her mother's funeral. Sarah Carter's memorial service, meant to be a quiet celebration of a teacher's life, turned into a media event as reporters gathered outside the church. Inside her Manhattan apartment, Ava struggled with the untold story, the contents of her mother's final letter. "My dearest Ava. It began, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. But remember what I always taught you, dignity isn't just about how others treat you, it's about how you choose to respond." The words felt like both comfort and challenge, pushing Ava to transform her personal tragedy into meaningful change. Meanwhile, in Queens, Miranda's life was unraveling. The airline suspension had cut off her primary income, and Emma's medical bills continued to mount. Their apartment building was besieged by reporters, making it difficult for Emma to attend her medical appointments. Neighbors who had once been friendly now avoided eye contact, and Emma's few school friends stopped coming over, their parents wary of association with the controversy. The situation at Emma's school deteriorated rapidly. Students who had previously only whispered their prejudices now felt emboldened. Like mother, like daughter became a cruel taunt, with kids suggesting Emma didn't belong in advanced classes, just like that lady didn't belong in first class. The parallel between what Emma faced and what Miranda had inflicted on Ava became a daily reminder of her mistake. Clara, the young flight attendant who had documented the incident, found herself caught between worlds. Her testimony had become central to the airline's investigation, and while some colleagues praised her integrity, others accused her of betrayal. She began receiving anonymous messages from other flight attendants sharing similar stories of discrimination they had witnessed but feared reporting. The medical community treating Emma also became embroiled in the controversy. When the story of Emma's experimental treatment needs became public, donations began pouring in, not from sympathy for Miranda, but from supporters of Ava Carter who saw an opportunity to demonstrate that prejudice could be overcome with compassion. Miranda found herself in the painful position of needing help from the very community she had wronged. Ava's corporate office became a hub of activity as she channeled her grief into action. She assembled a team of civil rights attorneys, including Dr. Wilson, to draft comprehensive anti-discrimination policies for the airline industry. But late at night, alone in her office, she would often find herself reading and rereading her mother's letter, seeking guidance in those final words. The strain began showing in both households. Emma's health took a downturn, the stress of the situation exacerbating her heart condition. Miranda spent sleepless nights by her daughter's hospital bed, watching the same news coverage that condemned her actions while praising Ava Carter's dignified response. The irony of seeking medical care for her daughter in the same hospital where Sarah Carter had spent her final days wasn't lost on her. Social workers became involved when Emma's school reported concerns about her deteriorating mental health. The young girl, once bright and engaged despite her illness, had become withdrawn. Her math scores, previously exceptional, began to slip. The very achievements that had made her a target now seemed to be slipping away under the weight of public scrutiny. In a bitter twist, both families found themselves isolated in different ways. Ava, surrounded by supporters and media attention, longed for private moments to grieve her mother. Miranda, shunned by her community, struggled to maintain normalcy for Emma while grappling with the public consequences of her actions. Both women were trapped in a narrative that had grown beyond their control. The breaking point came when Emma was rushed to emergency care after collapsing at school. As Miranda paced the hospital waiting room, she overheard two nurses discussing Ava Carter's latest press conference about airline discrimination. The worlds of victim and perpetrator collided in that sterile hospital corridor, connected by the threads of prejudice, consequence, and the universal language of loss. Looking out her apartment window at the gathering of reporters below, Ava made a decision. Her mother's letter had ended with a challenge: use what happens to you to help others, baby girl. That's how we change the world. It was time to move beyond public outrage and toward meaningful change, not just for the airline industry, but for all the Emmas and Avas who faced discrimination in their daily lives. The airline's corporate headquarters loomed over Manhattan like a glass fortress on the morning of Miranda's disciplinary hearing. She sat alone in a sterile conference room, her once pristine uniform feeling like a costume now. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see protesters gathered below, their signs demanding justice for Ava Carter. The disciplinary board filed in 5 senior executives, their faces masks of professional neutrality. Leading them was Catherine Reynolds, the airline's chief ethics officer, a woman known for her unwavering commitment to corporate accountability. Behind them came Clara, clutching her detailed documentation of the incident, and Dr. Wilson, whose presence as a witness carried the weight of his decades in civil rights law. M.S. Scott. Catherine began, her voice cutting through the tension. We're here to review the events of Flight 287 and your role in what has become a significant incident for this airline. Before we begin, do you understand that the outcome of this hearing could result in termination of your employment? Miranda's voice trembled as she responded. Yes, her phone buzzed in her pocket, another message from Emma's hospital. She had left her daughter in the pediatric ward that morning, promising to return with good news. Now, that promise felt impossible to keep. The evidence presentation began. Passenger videos played on the large screen, each angle showing Miranda's actions in stark detail. Clara's testimony followed, her young voice steady as she recounted the timeline of events. At 4:15 p.m., Ms. Carter received urgent messages about her mother's condition. Due to the seat reassignment, she lost access to power outlets and reliable phone signal. Mrs. Carter passed away at 4:47 p.m. Dr. Wilson spoke next, his legal expertise lending gravity to each word. What we witnessed wasn't just poor judgment, but a textbook case of discrimination. Ms. Scott made assumptions based on appearance and acted on those biases without any valid operational reason. As the evidence mounted, Miranda's carefully prepared defenses crumbled. How could she justify her actions when faced with their consequences? The moment of truth came when Catherine asked Ms. Scott, "What made you decide Ms. Carter didn't belong in first class?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Miranda opened her mouth to respond, but instead of her prepared statement, the truth spilled out. I made assumptions. The same kind of assumptions people make about my daughter every day." Her voice broke. "Emma has a heart condition. Yesterday she was bullied out of her advanced math class because someone decided she didn't belong there either." The room fell silent. Miranda continued, tears now flowing freely. "I've spent years fighting for Emma to be treated fairly, to be judged by her abilities, not her condition. And then I turned around and did exactly what I hate others doing to her. I became what I fear most, someone who judges without knowing, who takes away others' dignity because of prejudice." She pulled out her phone, showing them the message she'd received during the hearing. "My daughter is in the hospital right now at Mount Sinai, the same hospital where Mrs. Carter died. Emma's been having panic attacks because classmates are bullying her about what I did. I caused this cycle of pain and I don't know how to stop it." Catherine leaned forward, her expression stern but not unkind. "Ms. Scott, your personal circumstances, while tragic, don't excuse your actions. You denied a daughter her last moments with her dying mother because of unfounded prejudice. How do you think we should address this?" Miranda's response came from a place of raw honesty. "I don't expect to keep my job. I don't deserve to. But please, use my mistake to make real change. Don't let this be just about firing one flight attendant. Make it about changing the system that makes people like me think we have the right to decide who belongs where." The board members exchanged glances as Miranda's words settled in the room. Catherine made some notes before speaking again. "Ms. Scott, this hearing will require additional deliberation. However, I want you to understand that the repercussions of your actions extend far beyond this room. You've not only damaged this airline's reputation, but also betrayed the trust of our passengers and your colleagues." As the hearing concluded, Miranda stood on shaky legs. Through the windows, she could see more protesters arriving, their signs demanding justice. In her pocket, her phone buzzed again, another update from Emma's doctors. She had become both victim and perpetrator in a cycle of prejudice, and the weight of that realization was crushing. On the same day as Miranda's hearing, but in a different conference room 20 floors above, Ava Carter sat facing the airline's executive board. Her mother's final letter lay on the table before her, its presence a reminder of what had brought them all here. The room's tension was palpable as CEO Richard Harrison attempted to control the narrative. "Ms. Carter, we want to express our deepest condolences for your loss," Harrison began, sliding a folder across the table. "We've prepared a generous compensation package and we're implementing new sensitivity training." "Stop," Ava's voice cut through his practiced speech. She pushed the folder back unopened. "This isn't about compensation. My mother spent 30 years teaching children that their worth isn't determined by others' prejudices. I won't let her last experience with discrimination be swept away with a check." She pulled out Clara's documented account, along with statements from dozens of other passengers who had experienced similar discrimination. "This isn't an isolated incident. Your airline has a systemic problem, and Miranda Scott is just a symptom of it." The board members shifted uncomfortably as Ava continued. "Right now, in this same building, you're holding a disciplinary hearing for Ms. Scott. You'll probably fire her, issue a public apology, and consider the matter closed. But what about the culture that made her feel empowered to act on her prejudices? What about the system that failed to protect not just me, but countless others?" Harrison attempted to interject, but Ava raised her hand. "I'm not finished. While you've been preparing your damage control, I've been reading messages from people across the country. People who didn't have my resources or platform to fight back. People who silently accepted being moved, questioned, or humiliated because they didn't think they had a choice. She opened her mother's letter, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. My mother's last words to me written in this letter were about using our positions of influence to create real change. So here's what's going to happen. I'm not accepting your compensation. Instead, I'm proposing a complete overhaul of your policies, training, and corporate culture. Pulling out a detailed proposal, Ava laid out her demands: comprehensive anti-discrimination training developed by civil rights experts, transparent reporting systems for bias incidents, diverse hiring practices at all levels, and the establishment of a passenger advocacy board with real power to implement change. But most importantly, she continued, I want to create a scholarship program in my mother's name. For every incident of discrimination reported on your airlines, you'll fund a year of education for a student who faces similar prejudices. Let's turn moments of bias into opportunities for growth. The executives exchanged nervous glances as Ava revealed her final card. I've already spoken with your major corporate clients. They're waiting to see how you handle this. Your choice is simple: real change or real consequences. A junior board member spoke up. These demands are unprecedented. The costs. The costs. Ava's voice carried an edge of steel. Let's talk about costs. I lost my last moments with my mother because someone decided I didn't belong in a seat I had rightfully purchased. What's the cost of that? How do you calculate the value of a final goodbye? She stood, gathering her documents. You have 24 hours to decide. If you choose to fight this, I'm prepared to use every resource at my disposal to ensure this story stays in the public eye. Not for revenge, but for change. As she reached the door, she turned back. One more thing, I want to meet with Miranda Scott. Not to condemn her, but to understand how we can break this cycle of prejudice. Because right now, her daughter is in the hospital facing the same kind of discrimination her mother showed me. We either end this cycle now, or we admit we're willing to let it continue hurting the next generation. The boardroom remained silent as Ava left, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. Through the windows, they could see the protesters below, their signs demanding justice. But Ava had offered them something more valuable than justice. She had offered a path to redemption. In her wake, the executives faced a choice that would define not just their airline's future, but their role in addressing one of society's most persistent problems. The question wasn't whether they would act, but whether they would have the courage to make real, lasting change. The pediatric intensive care unit at Mount Sinai Hospital cast harsh shadows across Emma's pale face as the monitors beeped steadily beside her bed. Miranda sat slumped in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, still wearing her airline uniform from the disciplinary hearing. The doctor's words from an hour ago echoed in her mind. Her heart can't take this stress. Without the experimental treatment, we're running out of options. The irony wasn't lost on Miranda. Her daughter lay in the same hospital where Sarah Carter had spent her final days. The same halls where another daughter had rushed too late to say goodbye now witnessed Miranda's own vigil. Emma's condition had deteriorated rapidly after the school incident, the combination of bullying, stress, and public scrutiny proving too much for her fragile heart. Mom, Emma's voice was barely a whisper. I saw the news in the children's ward. They're calling you a racist. Her small hand reached for Miranda's, the IV tubes tangling with her movement. But I know you're not. You're just scared, like me. Scared of not belonging. Miranda's throat tightened. The disciplinary hearing suspension had cut off their health insurance, and with it, Emma's access to her regular medications. The experimental treatment they'd been saving for now seemed impossibly out of reach. The hospital had agreed to continue essential care on humanitarian grounds, but they couldn't approve expensive new treatments without guarantee of payment. Dr. Catherine Chen, Emma's cardiologist, entered the room with fresh charts. Her face carried the weight of difficult news. Miranda, Emma's latest tests show significant deterioration. The stress is causing her heart to work harder than it can handle, without intervention. She paused, choosing her words carefully. We need to discuss immediate options. Emma had drifted off to sleep, her face peaceful despite the tubes and monitors surrounding her. Miranda stood, following Dr. Chen into the hallway. Through the window, she could see news vans still parked outside the hospital, vultures waiting for the next development in the Flight 287 story. The experimental treatment, Miranda began, her voice breaking, if we could somehow get it. Dr. Chen shook her head gently. Even if you had the insurance, there's a waiting list. Emma's condition is progressing too rapidly. We need to act within days, not weeks. Miranda slid down the wall to the floor, her uniform crumpling around her. The same prejudices she had enacted on Flight 287 were now threatening her daughter's life. Her job, their insurance, Emma's future, all casualties of a moment of bias she couldn't take back. A nurse approached with a stack of forms, financial assistance applications, emergency care authorizations, and hospice care information. The word hospice sent a physical pain through Miranda's chest. This was what rock bottom felt like, watching her child suffer because of her own actions. Back in Emma's room, Miranda found her daughter awake again, attempting to solve math problems in her school notebook. Even now, Emma was trying to prove she belonged in that advanced class, fighting against prejudices that should never have touched her young life. "Mom," Emma said, putting down her pencil, "remember when you told me that being different doesn't make me less worthy? Maybe you should remember that too." The wisdom in her child's words felt like a knife to Miranda's heart. She had failed to live up to the very principles she had taught her daughter. Outside the hospital room, life continued its cruel march forward. Miranda could hear the nurses discussing the Flight 287 incident, unaware that its protagonist sat just feet away, watching her own daughter fade. The cost of prejudice had come full circle, and the price was being paid not just by Miranda, but by an innocent child who had only ever wanted to belong. In her Manhattan penthouse, Ava sat surrounded by the remnants of her mother's life-graded papers from decades of teaching, handwritten lesson plans about equality and dignity, and photographs of countless students whose lives Sarah Carter had touched. The untouched food Maya had brought lay cold on the coffee table as Ava read her mother's final letter for the 100th time. "My dearest Ava," the letter began, "if you're reading this, I couldn't hold on long enough to say goodbye in person. But remember what I always taught you: every moment of injustice is an opportunity to create change." The words blurred as fresh tears fell. Ava had failed to be there for that final goodbye, and now her mission for change felt hollow in the face of her grief. News coverage of the Flight 287 incident played silently on the television. Images of protesters outside the airline's headquarters mixed with clips of Miranda Scott's daughter being rushed to the hospital. The sight of Emma's small form on the gurney, attached to medical equipment, stirred something in Ava's chest. Another daughter suffering because of that day's events. The phone rang, another reporter seeking comment. Ava let it go to voicemail, instead picking up a photo of her mother with her last class. Sarah Carter stood proud among her students, her smile radiating the same warmth and dignity she had maintained until her final days. "Use your influence wisely," she had written in the letter. "Don't let anger guide your actions." Maya entered quietly, placing a newspaper on the desk. The headline caught Ava's eye: "Flight 287 Aftermath, Discriminator's Daughter Fighting for Life." The article detailed Emma Scott's deteriorating condition and the family's loss of medical insurance following Miranda's suspension. The cruel irony of another daughter potentially losing her mother, this time to circumstance rather than prejudice, wasn't lost on Ava. "Your mother would want you to rest," Maya said gently, noticing the dark circles under Ava's eyes. But rest felt impossible. Every time Ava closed her eyes, she saw her mother in those final hours, waiting for a daughter who would never arrive. The guilt of not being there mixed with the pain of knowing why, creating a tornado of emotion she couldn't escape. Clara had sent another message: Emma Scott's condition is critical. The experimental treatment she needs costs more than Miranda could earn in 5 years. "I know it's not my place, but I thought you should know." The young flight attendant had become an unexpected bridge between two worlds of pain. Ava walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Her mother's voice seemed to echo in her mind: teaching isn't just about sharing knowledge, it's about showing people how to transform pain into purpose. Sarah Carter had spent her life turning moments of discrimination into lessons about dignity and strength. Now her daughter faced the ultimate test of those teachings. The folder containing the airline's compensation offer sat unopened on her desk. The amount inside could easily save Emma Scott's life, but accepting it felt like putting a price tag on her mother's final moments. Yet refusing it meant potentially watching another daughter lose her chance at life. The weight of this decision pressed down on Ava like a physical force. Among her mother's papers, Ava found a student's essay from 1992. Mrs. Carter taught me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting wrongs, but about choosing to break cycles of hurt. The words resonated with a new meaning now. Her mother had always said that true strength lay not in the ability to punish, but in the courage to heal. As dawn broke over Manhattan, Ava made a decision. She couldn't bring back her mother's final moments, but she could honor her legacy by choosing grace over retribution. Emma Scott's life hung in the balance, and while justice was important, saving an innocent child's life mattered more. Her mother would have seen it as the ultimate lesson in dignity and compassion. Clara found Miranda in the hospital chapel, a crumpled letter of termination clutched in her hands. The young flight attendant hesitated at the door, watching her former colleague pray in the dim light. The afternoon sun filtered through stained glass, casting colorful shadows on Miranda's tear-stained face. "I thought I'd find you here," Clara said softly, moving to sit beside Miranda. "I've been talking with Ava Carter. There's something you need to know." She pulled out her phone, showing Miranda a series of text messages. "Before your mother passed, Mrs. Carter taught at Lincoln High School in Queens. She was Emma's math teacher's mentor 20 years ago." Miranda's hands trembled as she read the messages. Sarah Carter had spent decades fighting against the same prejudices that her daughter Ava faced on Flight 287. More incredibly, she had been instrumental in creating the advanced mathematics program that Emma now struggled to stay in. Mrs. Thompson, Emma's math teacher who stood by while she was bullied, Clara continued, she was one of Mrs. Carter's first student teachers. She learned about inclusion and dignity from the very woman whose daughter. Her voice trailed off as the implications sank in. Miranda's sob echoed through the empty chapel. The cosmic cruelty of it all, she had denied a final goodbye to the mother of the woman who had helped create opportunities for her own daughter. The cycle of prejudice had come full circle in the most devastating way. Clara reached into her bag, pulling out more documents. "There's more." Mrs. Carter left a foundation dedicated to supporting students facing discrimination in education. The foundation's main focus? Providing medical support for children with chronic conditions who excel academically. Emma would have qualified. The revelation hit Miranda like a physical blow. If she hadn't acted on her prejudices, if she had simply checked Ava's ticket instead of making assumptions, she might have learned about this connection. Her daughter might have already had access to the help she so desperately needed. Ava didn't know about this connection either, Clara explained gently. She's been reading through her mother's papers, finding decades of notes about students like Emma. Mrs. Carter believed that illness or difference should never define a child's potential. She fought against the same prejudices you showed on that flight. Through the chapel window, they could see the hospital's pediatric wing where Emma lay fighting for her life. The same building where Sarah Carter had spent her final hours waiting for a daughter who never arrived because of Miranda's actions. "There's one more thing," Clara said, pulling out a worn photograph. It showed a young Sarah Carter standing proudly with her first class of student teachers. In the front row, Miranda recognized a familiar face, her own mother, who had given up teaching to care for her sick child. The connections ran deeper than anyone had realized. Miranda stared at the photograph, her vision blurring with tears. Her own mother had learned about education equality from Sarah Carter, lessons she had passed on to Miranda before her death, lessons Miranda had forgotten in her fear and prejudice on Flight 287. "Mrs. Carter spent her life building bridges," Clara said softly. Her last letter to Ava wasn't just about saying goodbye. It was about continuing that work. And now, Miranda, you have a choice. You can let this revelation destroy you with guilt, or you can honor her legacy by helping to break this cycle of prejudice. Outside the chapel, the hospital intercom crackled with announcements. Somewhere above them, Emma fought for her life, unaware of the intricate web of connections that linked her story to Ava Carter's. And in that quiet chapel, Miranda began to understand that redemption might lie not in escaping the consequences of her actions, but in learning from them to create change. In her mother's study, surrounded by decades of teaching materials, Ava discovered a journal that changed everything. Written in Sarah Carter's distinctive handwriting was an entry from 15 years ago today. I met a remarkable student, Emma Scott. Only 5 years old, already showing incredible mathematical aptitude despite her heart condition. Her mother left teaching to care for her. But that light in Emma's eyes when she solves a problem, it's the same light I see in my Ava. Ava's hands shook as she read further. Her mother had been tracking Emma's progress for years, even after retirement. The last entry, dated just weeks before her death, read Emma Scott made the advanced math program. Her mother would be proud, but I hear she's working as a flight attendant now. Life takes unexpected turns, but that girl has her mother's determination. Maya entered with a hospital report Clara had sent over. Emma's condition is critical, she said softly. The doctors say without the experimental treatment, she trailed off, watching Ava's reaction carefully. Ava looked up from her mother's journal, tears streaming down her face. All this time we've been focusing on the wrong thing. This isn't about punishing Miranda Scott. It's about breaking the cycle. She stood, gathering her mother's papers with newfound purpose. The connection was clear now. Sarah Carter hadn't just been a teacher, she'd been a guardian of dreams for children like Emma. Her final letter took on new meaning. Use what happens to you to help others, baby girl. That's how we change the world. Ava reached for her phone, dialing the airline's board. Call an emergency meeting, she commanded, and get me Emma Scott's complete medical file. I'm not letting another daughter lose her chance because of prejudice. Within hours, Ava stood in the hospital corridor outside Emma's room, watching through the window as Miranda held her daughter's hand. The monitors beeped steadily, marking each precious moment. Clara stood beside Ava, providing quiet support. My mother believed in second chances, Ava said softly. She spent her life fighting against the same prejudices that took her final moments from me, but she also taught me that true change comes from breaking cycles, not perpetuating them. She opened her mother's journal to the last page, where Sarah had written, "Remember, Ava, every act of prejudice is an opportunity to show grace. That's how we teach the world to be better." Taking a deep breath, Ava pushed open the door to Emma's room. Miranda looked up, fear and shame crossing her face. But before she could speak, Ava held up her mother's journal. "Your daughter wasn't just another student to my mother," Ava said, her voice gentle. "She was proof of everything Mom believed in, that talent and worth aren't determined by health or circumstance. I can't bring back my mother's final moments, but I can honor her legacy by making sure Emma gets her chance." She placed the journal in a folder on Emma's bed. "This is the paperwork for my mother's educational foundation. The last thing she set up before her death was a medical scholarship fund. Emma's name is already on it, has been for years. Mom was just waiting for the right moment to help." Miranda's tears fell freely as she realized the depth of the connection. "I took your last moments with her," she whispered. "How can you possibly help us now?" Ava sat on the edge of Emma's bed, taking the young girl's free hand. "Because that's what my mother would have done. She taught me that breaking cycles of prejudice sometimes means being the first to offer grace. Emma deserves her chance, just like every student my mother ever fought for." Through the window, the setting sun cast long shadows across the hospital room, as two mothers' legacies finally intertwined in the way Sarah Carter had always intended, not through prejudice and pain, but through healing and hope. 1 year after Flight 287, the Sarah Carter Foundation for Educational Equality opened its doors in a renovated brownstone across from Lincoln High School. The building's entrance featured a simple plaque, "Every moment of prejudice is an opportunity for change." Inside, 2 photographs hung side by side, Sarah Carter teaching her last class and Emma Scott receiving her experimental treatment, both images testament to the power of breaking cycles. The Foundation's first initiative, launched jointly by Ava Carter and Miranda Scott, was the Second Chance program. It provided medical support for chronically ill students while fighting educational discrimination. Emma, now recovering and back in advanced math, had helped design the program's logo, a heart surrounding an equal sign. Miranda, no longer a flight attendant, had found her true calling as the Foundation's outreach coordinator. Her personal story of transformation became a powerful tool in their anti-discrimination workshops. Airlines across the country began sending their staff for training, learning how unconscious bias could have life-altering consequences. My mother always said that teaching isn't just about sharing knowledge. Ava addressed the Foundation's first graduating class. It's about showing people how to transform pain into purpose. The audience included Clara, now head of the airline's new passenger advocacy board, and Dr. Wilson, who had helped draft industry-wide anti-discrimination policies. Emma's recovery had become a symbol of hope. The experimental treatment, funded through the Foundation, had strengthened not just her heart but her determination to help others. She started a peer support group for students facing discrimination, naming it Mrs. Carter's Kids, in honor of the teacher who had believed in her before anyone knew their stories would intertwine. The airline had undergone its own transformation. Under Ava's guidance, they established the most comprehensive anti-bias training program in the industry. Every new employee heard the Flight 287 story, not as a cautionary tale but as proof that change was possible. The first-class cabin where everything had started now displayed a small reminder: everyone who belongs here, belongs here. On quiet evenings, Ava would find Miranda in the Foundation's library, surrounded by Sarah Carter's teaching materials. Together, they worked to integrate these lessons into their training programs, ensuring that Sarah's legacy of fighting prejudice lived on. Their unlikely friendship became proof that understanding could grow from even the most painful circumstances. The Foundation's walls were covered with success stories: students who had received medical support, families who had found hope, and countless instances where discrimination had been transformed into opportunity. Among them hung a framed copy of Sarah Carter's final letter, its message now touching lives far beyond its original intended recipient. Emma's mathematical achievements continued to grow. Her story of perseverance inspired a new generation of students to fight against prejudice while pursuing their dreams. When she spoke at schools, she always carried a photograph of Sarah Carter, sharing the story of the teacher who had believed in her through her mother's colleague without ever meeting her. The Foundation became more than just an organization. It was a living testament to Sarah Carter's belief that education could break cycles of prejudice. Each success story, each transformed life, each moment of understanding proved that change was possible, even from the darkest circumstances. As another group of students received their scholarships, Ava watched from her office window. Her mother's presence seemed to fill the room, echoing in every life touched by the Foundation. The tragedy of Flight 287 had transformed into something her mother would have been proud of: a force for genuine change. On the 5th anniversary of Flight 287, Ava Carter and Miranda Scott stood together on the Foundation's rooftop garden, watching the sunset over Queens. Below them, the building buzzed with activity as students attended after-school programs and families sought support. Emma, now a high school senior, was teaching a math tutorial to younger students with chronic conditions. "Your mother would be proud," Miranda said softly, touching the memorial plaque they had installed. She turned one moment of prejudice into a lifetime of change. The plaque bore Sarah Carter's words: "Dignity isn't just about how others treat you. It's about how you choose to respond." Ava smiled, remembering her mother's final letter. She knew something we had to learn the hard way: that breaking cycles of prejudice requires both justice and grace. Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself. Below, Emma's voice carried up through the evening air as she explained a complex equation to her students. Her heart condition, while still present, no longer defined her life. The experimental treatment had worked, giving her the strength to pursue her dreams while helping others fight their own battles. The Foundation had become a model for similar programs across the country. Airline schools and corporations sent representatives to learn how to transform their cultures. But more importantly, it had become a place where people learned to see beyond their prejudices, to recognize the humanity in each other. Miranda touched the airline wing she still kept in her desk drawer. "I thought losing my job was the worst thing that could happen," she reflected. "But it freed me to find my true purpose. Now I help others understand what I learned that day: that our prejudices don't just hurt others, they bind us too." Ava's phone buzzed with a message from Clara, now a senior executive in airline customer advocacy. Another carrier wanted to implement their training program. "Mom always said that real change happens one person at a time," Ava said. "She taught that in her classroom, and now we're teaching it to the world." As night fell over the city, lights began to twinkle in the Foundation's windows. In one room, a support group for families dealing with chronic illness shared their stories. In another, airline staff underwent bias training. Each light represented a small victory against prejudice, a step toward the world Sarah Carter had envisioned. Emma joined them on the roof, her textbooks clutched to her chest. "Mrs. Thompson asked me to speak at this year's graduation," she announced proudly, "about breaking cycles and building bridges." The same teacher who had once allowed her to be bullied had become one of the Foundation's strongest supporters, proving that change was possible at any age. "Your grandmother would have loved that," Ava said, hugging Emma. The moment captured everything the Foundation stood for: healing across generations, strength found in vulnerability, and the power of choosing grace over bitterness. As they stood together, 3 lives forever changed by one flight, they represented a larger truth that the greatest test of character isn't in avoiding mistakes, but in how we learn from them. The Foundation wasn't just Sarah Carter's legacy, it was proof that even the darkest moments could light the way to understanding. The city lights sparkled below them, each one representing a story, a struggle, a potential for change. In the distance, planes took off from JFK, carrying people from all walks of life. But now, thanks to the lessons learned from Flight 287, those flights carried something more: a commitment to seeing the humanity in every passenger, regardless of appearance or circumstance. "Mom used to say that teaching was about planting seeds you might never see grow," Ava said, watching the planes disappear into the night sky. "I think she'd be amazed to see how her lessons have bloomed." Together, they represented the final message Sarah Carter had tried to teach: that true change comes not from punishment or revenge, but from the courage to transform pain into purpose, prejudice into understanding, and moments of injustice into opportunities for grace. If this story touched your heart and resonated with your own experiences, we invite you to join our storytelling community. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How has prejudice affected your life, and what moments of grace have you witnessed? Help us spread these important messages by sharing this video with friends and family who might need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button to support our team in creating more meaningful content that bridges divides and inspires change. Together, we can transform stories of pain into narratives of hope and understanding.